as she walked into the grocery store for eggs, and left, accused, humiliated, and nearly broken by two young cops who saw her skin, not her story. But as their hands tore through her bag, a single gold necklace slipped into view, revealing a past so powerful it would shatter their careers before they even knew her name. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The morning was still, the kind of stillness that didn't need permission to exist. Eleanor Price sat at her small kitchen table, wrapping her thin fingers around a warm cup of mint tea. The steam drifted upward, tracing lines in the soft light of the window. She didn't rush mornings, not anymore. At 76, she had learned the power of moving slow in a world obsessed with fast. Her cane rested against the table leg, worn at the tip, its handle smoothed by years of quiet. Beside it, a navy moon-knit hat that had seen better days, but felt like home on her head. She glanced over at the folded grocery list, written in neat block letters. Eggs, oat milk, bread. The essentials, nothing fancy. Her fridge was never empty, but her life had been quieter lately. Not lonely, just quiet. There was a difference. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and looked at the clock. 8:32. She always left at 8:35, never earlier, never later. Routine wasn't habit for her. It was peace, a leftover discipline from another life. No one in this neighborhood knew she lived. She rose slowly, testing her knees. They protested softly, but she moved anyway. She slipped on her faded coat, the same one she had worn for years, and placed the delicate gold necklace over her blouse. It rested lightly against her chest, mostly hidden beneath the collar, a small medallion worn from years of quiet polishing. The world had told her this necklace was for ceremony only, to be tucked away in drawers and safe boxes. But Eleanor wore it to remind herself that she was once seen, once trusted, once needed. Even if the world forgot, she would not. Outside, the neighborhood stirred. Young men loitered near the corner store, their laughter sharp against the morning air. Mothers rushed their children along the sidewalks. Teens stared down at their phones, earbuds plugged in, tuned out. Eleanor walked past them, steady, unnoticed. The kind of invisible that came with gray hair and wrinkles. She didn't mind. Most days, invisibility meant peace, but somehow it meant something colder, something heavier. As she crossed Maple Street, she caught her reflection in the window of a barber shop. For a moment, the woman staring back was not 76, but 25, a cryptographer at the NSA, decoding intercepted transmissions in foreign tongues, preventing threats before they touched American soil. But that was decades ago. Back then, no one saw her either. Not the men who repeated her ideas louder, not the officials who signed her reports without reading her name, but her work spoke, even if they didn't listen. She shook the thought away. Today wasn't about the past, it was about getting eggs. At the corner, she paused at a faded crosswalk. Cars passed without slowing, even though she stood there with her cane clearly visible. She waited. Counted to 10, waited some more. Finally, a young woman in a silver sedan stopped and waved her through without looking up from her phone. Eleanor crossed, steady but slow, and offered a quiet nod the driver never saw. Bricewell Grocery sat across the street, its automatic doors yawing open and closed like a tired mouth. Inside waited shelves of ordinary things and faces that wouldn't recognize her if she screamed her resume from aisle 3. And yet, she walked toward it anyway. Because dignity wasn't something you left at home. You carried it step by step, whether they noticed or not. The sliding doors of Pricewell Grocery opened with a mechanical sigh as Eleanor stepped inside. The air smelled of disinfectant and faintly of overripe produce. She paused for a moment to adjust to the harsh fluorescent lights, then gripped her cane and pushed forward. The store was alive with the soft chaos of ordinary life. Two children argued over a box of sugary cereal, while their mother haggled with the cashier about a coupon. A man in a faded sports jacket debated over brands of peanut butter. Over by the frozen foods, a young couple whispered and laughed, wrapped in their own little world. No one noticed the small, elderly woman making her way down the canned goods aisle. No one saw the quiet set of her shoulders, or the careful way she steered her cart with her left hand while balancing her cane in the right. She didn't expect them to. She didn't need them to. She paused near the soup section, scanning the shelves for low-sodium chicken broth. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her mind remained sharp, calculating prices, remembering what was on sale. It was peaceful here, among the rows of silent goods. Eleanor liked the quiet decision. No arguments, no assumptions, just choices and labels. But peace has a way of breaking without warning. From the front of the store, a sharp voice sliced through the air. "Stop! Stop right there!" Eleanor stiffened, turning slightly toward the commotion but not moving. She could hear the hurried steps, the frantic rustling of jackets, the unmistakable tension of panic. A teenage boy burst from the self-checkout lanes, clutching something in his hand, his face a mixture of fear and desperation. An assistant manager pointed, flustered, and loud, "There! Stop her!" But his finger waved vaguely, in the direction of Eleanor just as she stepped from the aisle. She froze, heart sinking, as the situation shifted in a single breath. Behind her, boots slammed against tile. A voice barked, young, sharp, full of assumption. "Man, stop where you are." Eleanor turned, slow, confused. "Me?" But there was no answer. Just the thunder of fast steps and the tightening grip of someone who never asked who she really was. The officer's hand closed around Eleanor's arm before her question had even finished echoing in the air. His grip was firm, almost careless, as if the answer didn't matter. He was young, 25, maybe 26, with sharp eyes that didn't see, only scanned. Officer Alex Reese, rookie cop eager for a win, looking for a suspect in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Show me what's in your bag," he snapped. His voice cut through the quiet like broken glass. Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed. She blinked, stunned by the force of the moment. She clutched her purse close to her body, confused. "My purse?" she asked softly. Officer Reese's partner, Officer Derek Klein, jogged up, chest heaving slightly. He glanced around, trying to catch up to the scene, but he didn't question Reese's assumption. His eyes flicked to the manager, whose outstretched arm wavered with hesitation. The manager's voice faltered. "Wait, that's not..." But by then, the damage was done. Reese tightened his grip. "Don't play dumb," he barked. "What did you take?" Eleanor steadied her breath, speaking calmly but firmly. "Sir, I haven't taken anything. I'm here for eggs, that's all." But calmness, in moments like this, only sounded like defiance to those who refused to listen. Around them the store began to still. Conversations faded. Shopping carts rolled to quiet stops. Heads turned slowly, one by one, to witness the moment. And then, as Reese yanked her purse away, something slipped free from beneath Eleanor's sweater. A thin gold chain fell into the light. Dangling from it was a small, round pendant, simple but unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. At first, Reese didn't notice. His focus was on the bag, searching for some stolen candy bar or pack of batteries. But someone else did. From across the produce aisle, Brianna Thompson, early 30s, community college teacher, and part-time activist, froze, her phone already raised. Her eyes widened. She knew what that pendant was. "Wait, officer, look at her necklace," Brianna said, her voice cutting through the uneasy silence. Reese ignored her. He was too far down his own assumptions. "Officer," she repeated, louder now, her phone recording. "That's a VA intelligence commendation." The words landed like a dropped stone in a still pond. Klein blinked, confused. Reese finally looked down. There, catching the fluorescent lights, was a polished medallion bearing the unmistakable eagle and stars of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Beneath it, an engraving most civilians couldn't even read. The silence thickened. Reese's jaw tightened. Klein shifted awkwardly, realization creeping across his face. But it was too late. The crowd began to murmur. Phones rose into the air. Cameras clicked on. The store manager paled visibly. I think we have the wrong person," he stammered, but his words floated uselessly. Eleanor stood, calm and still. Not surprised, just tired. Because this wasn't the first time someone had grabbed her without asking who she really was. She spoke softly, but every word cut deeper than a raised voice ever could. "I spent decades defending a country that still doesn't recognize me when I walk down the aisle." And in that moment, the entire room realized this wasn't a thief. This was a woman who had seen more, done more, and sacrificed more than any of them could imagine. And they had just accused her of stealing eggs. Officer Reese's grip didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened, his knuckles whitening as if letting go would mean losing control. Eleanor felt the ache in her shoulder, old bones grinding against new arrogance. But she didn't cry out. Instead, she looked him in the eye, steady and clear. "Why are you stopping me?" she asked, her voice calm, even gentle. A question, not an accusation. But Reese heard defiance where there was only dignity. "Stop playing games," Reese snapped. "What's in your bag?" Eleanor shifted slightly, adjusting her cane, keeping her balance as best she could. "Groceries," she said softly. "The kind I've bought every Saturday for the last 12 years. But Officer Reese wasn't listening. He wasn't looking for an answer. He was looking for confirmation of a story he had already written in his mind. In that story, an elderly black woman walking alone was suspicious. In that story, guilt was proven by proximity, not by evidence. His partner, Officer Derek Klein, hovered nearby, his eyes darting between Eleanor and the gathering crowd. He wasn't sure anymore. Something about the way this woman stood so still, so quiet, it didn't match the profile of a thief. "Reese, maybe we should check with the manager again," Klein offered hesitantly. But Reese cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. His pride was a freight train, and it wasn't stopping now. "Open the bag," Reese demanded again, louder this time. Eleanor held the strap of her purse tighter. "I assure, with all due respect, I will not open my bag without cause. I've done nothing wrong." The room seemed to shrink around them. The hum of the freezers, the rustle of paper bags, even the music playing faintly over the speakers, all faded into silence. And then, in the middle of this stillness, it happened. As Reese pulled harder on her purse, something slipped free. A thin chain, a small pendant. It swung into the light between them, catching the harsh fluorescence in a sudden golden flash. Reese froze. Klein blinked, unsure of what he was seeing. And, from the edge of the produce section, Brianna Thompson gasped. The camera in her hand shook as she zoomed in, realizing what no one else seemed to notice yet. There, hanging just above Eleanor's heart, was a VA Intelligence Commendation, a federal honor awarded to a select few whose service remained classified, invisible to the public eye. Brianna's voice broke through the tension like thunder on a clear day. "Officer," she said, steady now, "look at her necklace." But Reese, caught in the storm of his own certainty, didn't turn. He tugged again at Eleanor's bag, chasing the thief he thought he'd already found. Brianna stepped forward now, her voice gaining volume and sharpness. "Officer," I said, "look at her necklace." She held up her phone, recording every second, her hands trembling but steady enough to capture the truth. Around them, the crowd thickened, faces filled with disbelief, their quiet shopping trips shattered by injustice unfolding before their eyes. Officer Klein finally leaned in, squinting as the pendant caught his eye. His stomach dropped. The insignia was unmistakable. A polished gold circle with an eagle stretching across a ring of 13 stars. Beneath it, an engraving only federal departments used. This wasn't a charm from a souvenir shop. It was a Department of Veterans Affairs intelligence commendation. Rare, sacred, earned through sacrifice most people could barely imagine. Reese, Klein whispered, the first trace of doubt breaking through his partner's stubborn facade. But Reese shook his head, unwilling to let go of his certainty. His pride screamed louder than the truth dangling in front of him. Could have stolen that too, Reese muttered, his voice laced with suspicion, not reason. The words hung in the air, thick and bitter. Brianna's face tightened. Someone in the crowd gasped aloud, and Eleanor, for the first time, let a faint, tired smile cross her lips. Not amusement, but resignation. "My life," she said softly. "I've been questioned before I've been understood." The words silenced even the hum of the freezers. For a moment no one spoke. The room held its breath. Valentine's face paled. The assistant manager, Mr. Farley, pushed through the crowd now, his cheeks flushed and his tie askew. He raised his hands awkwardly, his voice cracking. "Wait, officers, I think we've made a mistake," Farley stammered, his eyes darting from Eleanor's calm gaze to the glaring phones pointed at the scene. Reese shot him a hard glare. "You said, stop her. You pointed at her." "I meant the kid," Farley whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of his error. "The boy who ran from the self-checkout. This isn't her." Reese's grip loosened slightly, but didn't release. His ego wrestled with reality. Around them, the crowd began to murmur, voices low but sharp. "She's innocent. This is racial profiling. She's got a military medal, for God's sake." Brianna spoke again, firmer now, her voice steady against the tension. "Officer, let her go, right now, before this turns into something worse." Eleanor stood there, quiet and still, her presence more powerful than any argument. She didn't yank her arm away. She didn't shout. She waited, patient but unyielding. And in that waiting, the whole room saw the truth. Power didn't always come from noise. Sometimes it came from knowing exactly who you were, even when others refused to see it. Officer Reese stood frozen, his authority slipping from his hands. Klein shifted beside him, uneasy and silent. The crowd's phones stayed pointed at them, catching every breath, every hesitation. And in that moment, under the harsh grocery store lights, the story they thought they were writing began to collapse in their hands. Klein took a hesitant step forward, his voice quieter, almost human now. "Reese, maybe we should step back. This isn't what we thought." But Reese stood frozen, the carton of eggs still in his gloved hand, as if he were waiting for reality to rewrite itself. His face flushed, not with embarrassment, but with something colder. Fear of being wrong, fear of losing control in front of all these eyes and cameras. The assistant manager wrung his hands, his voice shaking as he tried again to explain. "She's a regular officer. She's here every Saturday morning. I think you mistook her for the kid." But Reese barely heard him. His eyes darted toward the phones pointed in his direction. Each glowing screen was a witness, a judge, and an executioner, all rolled into one. And yet, Eleanor stood there, still, composed, her cane resting at her side, not afraid, not apologetic, just tired. Tired of having to explain her existence, tired of having to earn basic decency. Brianna lowered her phone slightly, her voice gentler now but no less firm. "Officer, it's time to let her go, before this gets worse." Klein nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "He's right, Alex. This isn't the right call." For a long moment, no one moved. And then, finally, Reese let out a sharp breath and released Eleanor's arm. She gently rubbed her shoulder where his grip had left a dull ache. The assistant manager stepped in quickly, words tumbling over themselves. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for this, truly. This was a huge misunderstanding." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, the faintest hint of a frown pulling at the corner of her mouth. She studied him, not with anger, but with deep disappointment. "Oh, so now I'm a misunderstanding," she said softly, the words cutting sharper than any yell. "A moment ago, I was a suspect." The crowd stirred again, some nodding, some whispering to each other. Reese stood stiffly, saying nothing, his authority slipping like sand through his fingers. Klein shifted awkwardly beside him, regret flickering across his face. But Eleanor didn't wait for apologies that wouldn't come. She straightened her shoulders and adjusted her cardigan, the necklace catching the light once more. She looked at the faces around her, some shocked, some ashamed, some simply curious, and spoke as if addressing them all. "Spent a lifetime solving problems no one wanted to admit existed. And yet, even now, I walk into a store for groceries and leave accused of stealing my own dignity." The words echoed, low and steady, and no one dared interrupt. Reese finally muttered, his voice hollow, "You can go now." Eleanor smiled faintly, not out of kindness, but out of clarity. "I was never the one who needed permission to leave." With that, she turned and walked away, her cane tapping softly against the floor, each step a quiet rebellion against the narrative they tried to write for her. Behind her, the store remained silent. No one stopped her. No one dared. And in that silence, the truth hung heavier than all their badges combined. Brianna Thompson stood just outside the sliding doors of Pricewell Grocery, her phone trembling slightly in her hand. Her heart was still pounding from what she had witnessed, but her voice stayed calm as she typed the caption. "Grabbed a war hero without asking a single question." She hit upload. The video was only 43 seconds long, just enough to catch the confrontation, the flash of the necklace, and Eleanor's quiet words that stopped the room cold. At first, only a few notifications buzzed across her screen. Friends, neighbors, a handful of followers who always paid attention when she posted about injustice in their sleepy town. But within 10 minutes, the notifications didn't stop. Shares, retweets, comments pouring in faster than she could read them. Who is this woman? Did they just grab a veteran without cause? Tag the VA. Tag every news outlet. This can't be real. By the time Brianna walked to her car, the video had passed 5,000 views. By the time she pulled into her driveway, it had crossed 25,000. She set her phone down, her hands shaking, tears prickling the corners of her eyes, not because she wanted this to go viral, but because it already had. And somewhere in that quiet house, Eleanor Price sat alone, unaware that her quiet humiliation was now public reckoning. Across town, in the sterile confines of the precinct, Officer Reese scrolled through his phone with growing dread. His name wasn't trending yet, but the video was, his face, his actions, his mistake. Klein sat across from him, head in his hands. "This is bad, man. This is really bad." Reese tried to shake it off. "It's just social media. They'll move on tomorrow." But even as he said it, another notification popped up. National veterans groups were sharing the clip. Prominent activists were retweeting it with hashtags like "Respect Our Elders" and "Invisible No More." By nightfall, the video passed 50,000 views, comment sections filled with outrage, heartbreak, and disbelief. She wore a necklace that saved lives, and they still treated her like a suspect. America loves its veterans, until they look like Eleanor Price. Imagine serving your country, only to be manhandled for groceries. And before midnight, local reporters started calling the precinct. And Reese's confidence cracked for the first time all day. Across town, Eleanor sat in her kitchen, oblivious to the digital storm rising outside her window. The kettle hissed softly as she poured herself a cup of tea, unaware that her face was now splashed across countless screens. She didn't own a smartphone. She preferred the quiet hum of the radio, the rustle of a newspaper, the steady beat of silence. But the world wouldn't let her stay invisible this time. By morning, the calls began. A neighbor knocked on her door holding a tablet. "Miss Price, I think you should see this." Reluctantly, Eleanor leaned in. Her own face stared back at her from the screen, paused mid-sentence beneath bold headlines. Decorated NSA cryptographer mistreated at local grocery store. Veteran of the Cold War profiled by police. The silent hero they ignored. She closed her eyes briefly, a sigh escaping her lips. Not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. She had spent 30 years preventing the kinds of threats that never made headlines. And now, it was a grocery trip that finally made the world pay attention. As the hours passed, pieces of her history resurfaced in the public conversation. Recruitment out of Spelman College during the Cold War. Fluent in 5 languages. Intercepted transmissions that prevented a chemical weapons transfer in North Africa. Uncovered coded communications that averted a coup in Eastern Europe. All those nights spent in dimly lit rooms, decoding enemy plans faster than the mainframes could process them. She never wore a uniform, but she fought a war few people knew existed. There were no statues for women like her, no parades, just a quiet line in a classified memo. Analyst Eleanor Price, clearance level 4. She left the NSA in 1993 without ceremony, just a quiet exit and a box of things she wasn't allowed to speak of. And for the last 30 years, she had lived a life of quiet routine. Until one moment of injustice ripped the curtain back. The mayor's office called. The Department of Veteran Affairs called. Reporters from CNN and NBC wanted statements. But Eleanor didn't answer right away. She sat in her small kitchen, stirring her tea, and whispered to herself, "So now they want to listen." Outside, the story was no longer just hers. It was a conversation about every veteran, every woman, every Black American whose service went unseen. And as the news cycle churned, the questions grew louder. No one knew who she was. Why did it take a necklace for people to pay attention? Who else have we silenced without seeing first? The city woke up to headlines it wasn't ready to face. Faith leaders posted their own reflections, quoting Eleanor's words. Civil rights advocates shared the footage with hashtags calling for dignity, not just justice. Veterans organizations from across the country posted tributes to Eleanor, calling her one of the silent protectors of the Cold War. A retired colonel wrote on his blog, "I never met Eleanor Price, but I worked in rooms protected by people like her, and I've never been pulled over for buying eggs." At Pricewell Grocery, the corporate office scrambled to contain the damage. They issued a brief statement late that afternoon. "We regret the unfortunate misunderstanding involving Ms. Price, and are reviewing our protocols to ensure such incidents do not occur again." It was thin, mechanical, and full of nothing. The community wasn't satisfied. Brianna Thompson, watching the response from her living room, shook her head and typed a single comment that thousands would repost within the hour. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. She was a person, and you treated her like a threat." By noon, a peaceful gathering formed outside Pricewell. Not a protest, a presence, seniors with canes, mothers with strollers, veterans in their faded caps, students with handmade signs reading, "See us the first time." Inside the precinct, the weight of the moment finally crashed down on Reese and Klein. The police chief summoned them into his office. The blinds were closed. The tension in the air could have cut glass. He tossed a printout of the video transcript onto the table. "Explain yourselves." Reese leaned forward, still trying to salvage control. "Sir?" The manager pointed in her direction. "We acted quickly to prevent further loss." The chief cut him off with a glare sharp enough to stop time. "Law." She was carrying a carton of eggs and a tea tin. "Did you ever stop to ask her name before you grabbed her like a criminal?" Reese tried to steady his voice. "We didn't know who she was." "And that," the chief said coldly, "is exactly the problem." Klein sat silently, shame creeping across his face. By the end of the meeting, both officers were placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. The official statement read, "Pending review of conduct during the Pricewell grocery incident, Officers Reese and Klein have been temporarily relieved of duty to ensure an unbiased investigation." But in the community, no statement could undo what had been seen. Parents spoke about the fear they carried when sending their children to the corner store. Veterans spoke of the invisibility they lived with after their service ended. And at the center of it all was Eleanor Price. She didn't ask for the spotlight. She didn't want the trending hashtags or the headlines. She just wanted to shop in peace. But now her story wasn't hers alone. It belonged to a city forced to face the uncomfortable truth it had ignored for too long. The city council called an emergency session to discuss community trust initiatives. Faith leaders called for police accountability. Veterans groups called for respect without question. And through it all, Eleanor sat by her window, watching the sun drift across the street outside. She had seen storms before. This one was just louder. She placed her necklace gently on the table beside her tea. The world knew her name now. But the question remained, what would they do with it? The knock came just after noon, not loud, not demanding, just steady enough to say, "I am here, and I won't leave until you answer." Eleanor rose slowly from her chair, setting down her tea with care. She adjusted her cardigan, her fingers brushing lightly over the necklace that now felt heavier than usual. When she opened the door, she found a woman standing there in full uniform, sharp navy blue blazer, polished shoes, and an insignia pinned just above her heart. The woman's presence filled the small porch with quiet authority. "Monsieur Eleanor Price?" the woman asked gently. Eleanor nodded. "That's me." The woman extended her hand. "Captain Lydia Morales, Department of Veteran Affairs, Intelligence Directorate. May I come in?" Eleanor hesitated, then stepped aside, motioning her in. "It's been a long time since anyone from that side of my life came knocking." Captain Morales smiled softly as she entered, removing her hat out of respect. "Ma'am, I assure you, we don't make house calls lightly, but after what happened, we had to." They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight stretching across the worn wood like an old friend. Morales placed a slim black folder between them and opened it. Inside was a formal letter, written on heavy paper with a gold federal seal. She read aloud, her voice steady but not cold. "On behalf of the Department of Veteran Affairs, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the citizens of the United States, we extend our deepest apology for the indignity you suffered and the failure to recognize your service. You served in silence, and we failed to match your sacrifice with protection in peace." Morales slid the letter toward Eleanor, along with a framed commendation recognizing 30 years of classified service. "We also respectfully invite you to speak at the National Women in Intelligence Conference next month. The director himself will be in attendance." Eleanor looked down at the letter, then at the frame. Her fingers traced the gold seal, the weight of those unspoken years pressing against her chest. She shook her head gently. "I didn't serve for applause, Captain. I served for results, and results rarely come with cameras." Morales didn't argue. She had read Eleanor's file. She knew this woman had diffused global crises before most people ate breakfast. But still, she spoke with care. "I understand. But sometimes, Miss Price, showing up gives permission for others to be seen." Eleanor smiled faintly, a tired smile, but genuine. "I'll think about it, but I won't wear a speech. I'll wear the truth." Morales nodded, rising to leave. "That's all we ask." And with that she left Eleanor alone again, surrounded by reminders of a life most people would never fully understand. That evening, Eleanor's niece Simone burst through the front door, her face a mixture of worry and awe. She held her phone up, its screen still lit with the headlines. "Auntie, what is going on?" You're all over the news." Eleanor sat by the window, polishing her necklace with a soft cloth, calm as a mountain in a storm. "I heard," Eleanor said gently, setting the necklace down. Simone paced the living room, unable to stay still. "They said you worked for the government. Intelligence something. Cold War cryptographer. Is it true? Why didn't you ever tell us?" Eleanor smiled softly, the corners of her eyes crinkling with age and memory. "Because real service doesn't need applause, Simone. It needs results. And when your work saves lives, you learn to live with silence." Simone stopped pacing, sitting down across from her aunt, frustration and admiration mixing in her voice. "He deserved to know. I deserve to know. You're a hero, Auntie." Eleanor shook her head, her voice low and steady. "No, child. Heroes chase the spotlight. I was never chasing anything. I was just doing what needed to be done." Simone swallowed hard. "But what about now? This story, it's everywhere. People need to hear from you. They need to know you're real." Eleanor looked out the window, watching the evening shadows stretch across the street. "I didn't ask to be a symbol. I just asked to be left alone to buy my groceries in peace." Simone leaned forward, lowering her voice. "But what about all the people who can't defend themselves with a necklace? What about them?" The room fell quiet for a long moment. Eleanor sighed softly, her heart heavier than the metal resting on her chest. "That's why I'm thinking of going to the town forum," she said finally. "Not for me. For the ones who can't wear medals. For the ones whose worth is questioned before their names are known." Simone's eyes softened, pride replacing frustration. "You won't be alone," she said quietly. "I'll be right there with you." Eleanor smiled, small but genuine. "I know, baby. That's why I can go." And, for the first time that day, the weight of being seen didn't feel quite so heavy. 2 days later, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, a printed flyer resting beside her morning tea. Town Forum, Community Trust and Dignity in Law Enforcement. The words felt sterile, too polished for the messiness of what really needed fixing. But she knew what it meant beneath the political phrasing. It was an invitation for her to stand in front of the very people who had watched her dignity questioned, and to say something they couldn't ignore. The mayor's assistant had called earlier, politely asking if she would like a security escort, a car, maybe a prepared speech. Eleanor politely declined them all. She didn't need an escort to speak her truth, and she certainly didn't need a speechwriter to tell her what she had lived. That afternoon, she pulled open a small drawer in her bedroom. Inside were faded mementos of a life spent in quiet service, an old photograph of her NSA unit, a memo thanking her for decrypting a broadcast in 1981 that stopped a weapons shipment bound for the wrong hands. No headlines, no front pages, just a quiet acknowledgement, stamped. She laid the necklace beside the papers, staring at it for a long moment. It wasn't supposed to be worn in public. It was given as a personal commendation, a quiet thank you from a world that didn't want its protectors to be seen. But today, she would wear it anyway. Not for them. For herself. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Eleanor buttoned her cardigan, adjusted her knit hat, and looped the necklace gently around her neck. The town hall wasn't far, but her knees protested the walk. Still, she walked it. When she arrived, the parking lot was already full. Cars lined the street, and people gathered outside in quiet conversation. Some carried signs reading, "Respect before rank," and "Dignity has no age limit." Inside, the room buzzed with quiet tension. City officials, community leaders, and everyday residents packed the rows of folding chairs. Cameras sat at the back of the room, their red lights blinking steadily. And in the front row sat Officers Reese and Klein, their badges removed for disciplinary review, their faces unreadable. The mayor took the podium first, clearing his throat. "We are gathered here tonight not to assign shame, but to hear truth, not to cover what happened, but to confront why it happened. And the next voice we need to hear is hers. He stepped aside, and the room fell still. Eleanor rose slowly, her cane clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Every eye followed her as she approached the podium, but she did not flinch. She adjusted the microphone, looked out at the faces watching, and took a deep breath. "I didn't come here tonight for applause," she began, her voice steady. "I didn't come here to relive that morning. I came because what happened to me happens every day to people without a necklace to prove their worth." The room stayed silent, hanging on every word. "I was stopped because someone saw my color before they saw my character, my age before my dignity, my presence before my humanity." She turned slightly, facing Reese and Klein directly. "I don't need your apologies. I need your reflection, because next week I won't be in that store, but someone else will, and she may not have a medal around her neck, just her groceries, and that should be enough." A single voice from the back whispered, "Amen." Eleanor let the silence fill the space where anger could have lived. And in that silence, the truth spoke louder than outrage ever could. The town hall gym hadn't been this full in decades. Rows of folding chairs stretched wall to wall, packed shoulder to shoulder, with faces from every part of the city. Black, white, Latino, Asian, old veterans in worn caps, high school students in basketball hoodies, single mothers clutching their toddlers on their laps. The buzz of whispered conversations filled the air like static before a storm. Everyone was waiting for one voice. On the raised stage, the mayor sat in the center, flanked by the police chief, the city council, and a few community leaders whose names rarely left the meeting minutes. They all looked uncomfortable, as if unsure whether they were leading or being led. In the front row, officers Reese and Klein sat side by side, both wearing plain suits without badges. Reese's shoulders were stiff, his jaw locked tight. Klein sat with his hands folded, head slightly bowed, his eyes scanning the floor like it could offer him an escape. They weren't alone. The whole room saw them now, and no badge could shield them from that gaze. Near the stage stairs, Eleanor stood in the wings, cane in hand, her niece Simone at her side. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. Simone squeezed her hand gently. "Whenever you're ready." Eleanor breathed in slowly, then stepped forward. The mayor rose, his voice formal but thin. "Next speaker needs no introduction, but she deserves one. Ms. Eleanor Price has spent her life in service to this country, to justice and to truth. Tonight, we welcome her voice." He stepped aside. The room fell still. Eleanor walked slowly to the podium, the quiet click of her cane against the hardwood floor echoing louder than any applause. She adjusted the microphone and looked out across the faces waiting to hear her. And then, with a voice steady as a mountain wind, she spoke. "I was taught that dignity is not something you earn with medals. It's something you are born with." The words struck the room like thunder. No one moved. No one spoke. They just listened. Because for once, the silence wasn't erasure. It was reverence. Eleanor paused, letting the words settle in the air like dust in sunlight. She looked down for a moment, gathering her thoughts, not from a speech, but from her lived experience. "I didn't come here to demand your respect," she continued, her voice calm but unyielding. "I came to remind you that every human being is already worthy of it." In the second row, a woman dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. A teenage boy beside her sat straighter, in his seat. Eleanor's gaze swept over the crowd, then returned to the two men in the front row, who had grabbed her arm without asking her name. "I wore this necklace," she said, her fingers brushing against the gold pendant resting against her chest, "not to remind you of my service, but to remind myself that no one gets to define my worth but me." Reese shifted uncomfortably, his throat tight, as if the room itself was pressing down on him. "I spent decades decoding enemy transmissions," Eleanor said, her voice softening, "saving lives in countries you've never been to. But even after all that, I walked into a grocery store for eggs, and somehow I was still a suspect." A hush fell over the room, heavy and sharp. "Ask yourselves," she said, her voice steady, "how many others have you judged before they had a chance to speak? How many times have you written a person's story before they told you their name?" She looked straight at Reese and Klein. "This isn't just about me. Next week, another black woman will walk into that store. She won't be wearing a necklace. She won't have a resume stamped by the government. She'll just have her groceries. And that should be enough." Tears quietly rolled down Simone's cheek as she listened from the side of the stage. Eleanor let her final words hang in the air, unhurried, unafraid. "Dignity doesn't ask for permission. It simply is. You can choose to see it, or you can choose to ignore it. But either way, it's there." She stepped back from the podium, leaving the microphone to hum softly in the quiet that followed. The room remained still. No applause yet. Just silence. And in that silence, the weight of truth was undeniable. The stillness stretched long enough to feel like forever. Then, shifting in his chair, Officer Reese slowly rose to his feet. His face was pale, his voice tight, as if the words cost him something he'd never had to pay before. I didn't know who you were," he said quietly, his words falling into the hush of the room. Eleanor looked at him, her expression calm but unsparing. "That's the point," she replied, her voice low but clear. "You shouldn't have needed to—" Reese stood there for a moment, searching for something more to say, but nothing came. Not a defense, not an excuse. Only a hollow space where understanding should have been. Klein rose beside him, his hands fidgeting slightly. His voice was softer, but steadier. "I was wrong. We were wrong," Klein said, meeting Eleanor's gaze. "And I can't change what we did, but I can start by owning it." A murmur passed through the crowd. Not anger this time, but something closer to relief. A beginning, maybe. A small crack where light could slip through. The mayor cleared his throat but said nothing, recognizing that this moment wasn't his to fill. Eleanor nodded, slow and deliberate, but she didn't smile. She didn't offer forgiveness. "Words are easy," she said gently. "Change is hard. Start there." The room stayed quiet for a moment longer, letting the weight of her message land where it needed to. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Slow at first, hesitant, then another, and another. The applause wasn't loud or explosive. It was steady, respectful, purposeful. Not applause for Eleanor, but for the truth finally spoken aloud. Simone wiped her eyes and smiled through her tears, watching her aunt stand taller than she had in years. Brianna Thompson, seated near the middle of the crowd, lowered her phone for once and simply listened, soaking in the moment that didn't need a recording to be remembered. Reese sat back down, shoulders lower now, the pride that once propped him up, now stripped away, leaving only reflection. Klein followed, his mind spinning with questions that would take him a lifetime to answer. The mayor finally spoke, voice quieter than before. "Thank you, Ms. Price, for your service and for your truth. I think we all have work to do." The police chief nodded silently beside him, knowing this wasn't the kind of fix that came from policies alone. Outside, the night air was cool against the gathering crowd. People spilled onto the steps of the gym, their conversations softer now, more thoughtful. Some shook Eleanor's hand as she exited. Others simply nodded, offering a kind of respect that didn't need words. Simone walked beside her aunt, quiet for a few steps before speaking. "You really shook them, Auntie." Eleanor smiled faintly, her cane tapping rhythmically against the sidewalk. "I didn't shake them. she said softly. The truth did. I just stopped hiding it. Behind them, the town hall lights dimmed as people filed out. But something remained in that room, an awareness that couldn't be switched off or packed away. It was the kind of awareness that turned meetings into movements, that turned policies into promises. Eleanor paused at the curb, looking out over the quiet streets of the town she had called home for decades. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a visitor in her own story. She felt present, not for her medals, but for her humanity. As she and Simone walked away, the cameras faded, the voices lowered, and the night reclaimed its quiet. But somewhere deep in that quiet, change had already begun. The Monday after the forum, the precinct doors felt heavier than usual. Inside, the air was thick with whispers and side glances. Internal Affairs had officially opened a formal investigation into officers Reese and Klein, and the inquiry ran deeper than either man had expected. It wasn't just about Eleanor Price anymore. Complaints from months, even years before, began to resurface. People who had been too scared or too tired to speak up before now found their voices. A young black father came forward, describing how Reese had pulled him aside at a gas station last summer, claiming he matched a description while buying snacks for his kids. A Latina grandmother filed a complaint about Klein questioning her outside a pharmacy 2 years ago, after someone reported a suspicious older woman waiting for a ride. None of these incidents had gone viral, none had made headlines, but they painted a pattern Eleanor's story had finally forced into the light. The police chief sat across from the two officers in the cramped conference room, his voice sharp but controlled. I warned both of you. Policing is about asking first, assuming last. But it seems you flipped that order more than once. Reese crossed his arms, defensive. They're only complaining now because of the video. The chief's glare stopped him cold. No, Reese. They're speaking now because they finally believe someone will listen. Klein sat quietly, his thoughts racing. The mayor issued a public statement later that afternoon, calling for deep reflection and swift reform within the department. But words from the top didn't erase what had happened on the ground. Community groups called for transparency. Churches held prayer vigils for dignity and justice. And all over social media, Eleanor Price's quiet stand became a rallying cry. Not just for what happened to her, but for what had happened to so many before her who didn't have a necklace to prove their worth. The city was awake now, and no amount of spin could put it back to sleep. Late Wednesday afternoon, as the sun dipped low over Maple Street, a hesitant knock sounded at Eleanor's door. She rose slowly, steadying herself with her cane, and opened it to find Officer Derek Klein standing there, hat in hand, his posture uncertain. He wasn't in uniform, just a plain shirt and slacks, looking far more human than the badge had ever made him appear. Mrs. Price, he began softly, his voice tight with nerves. I wanted to come here, not as an officer, but as a person who got it wrong. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying his face. There was no arrogance now, only the quiet weight of someone facing himself for the first time. Come in, she said, stepping aside, but I don't offer coffee for guilt. Klein managed a small, sheepish smile and followed her inside. They sat at the kitchen table, where sunlight filtered through faded curtains and lit the framed commendation from the VA still resting against the wall. He stared at it for a moment, then lowered his gaze. I didn't see you that day. I mean, I saw you, but I didn't see you, he said, voice cracking slightly. I followed protocol, but I forgot my humanity. Eleanor sat still, letting his words settle. You didn't forget your humanity, she said gently but firmly. You buried it. That's what the job tempts you to do. But the badge doesn't erase your eyes, Klein. You still have to use them. He nodded slowly, the truth of her words sinking deep. I replayed it in my head 1,000 times, he admitted. How I could have paused, asked a question, waited for an answer, but instead, I saw what I was trained to suspect, not the person who was standing there. Eleanor's gaze softened, but her voice stayed steady. Regret is easy, Officer Klein. Change is hard. He looked down at his hands, wringing them together. I want to change, but I don't know where to start. She paused, considering his question, then spoke slowly. Start by seeing the people you pass on the street, the ones you stop on a call, the ones who don't look like you, live like you, vote like you. See them first, before you judge them. Klein nodded, a lump forming in his throat. I can do that. Eleanor leaned back slightly, her voice soft but sharp. Then do it, but don't come back here unless your actions speak louder than your words. He met her gaze, steady for the first time. Understood. He stood to leave, placing his hat back on his head, the weight of the visit heavier than the badge ever was. As he reached the door, he turned back one last time. Thank you for your patience. You didn't have to give it. Eleanor offered a small smile, tired but kind. I didn't give it for you. I gave it for the next person you'll meet. And with that, Derek Klein stepped out into the fading light, unsure of his future but certain of one thing. He couldn't go back to who he was before he knocked on that door. The following morning, Eleanor awoke to the sound of her landline ringing. She answered slowly, expecting another neighbor checking on her, or perhaps another stranger, offering praise she never asked for. But this call was different. Mr. Price, this is Rachel Ford from Good Morning America. We'd be honored to have you join us for a national interview. People everywhere want to hear your story. America needs voices like yours right now. Eleanor smiled softly to herself, the kind of smile that held no bitterness, only weariness. Miss Ford, I appreciate the invitation, she said kindly, but I didn't stand up to be seen on your morning show. I stood up because I was tired of being invisible in my own neighborhood. There was a pause on the other end. Rachel tried again. Your words could inspire millions. This moment, this is your platform. Eleanor's voice stayed calm. My platform is wherever injustice walks freely and dignity stays silent. And right now, that's not your studio. It's my community. She thanked her again, then gently hung up the phone. For Eleanor, the spotlight was never the goal. Change was. And change rarely came with applause. Later that afternoon, Simone arrived with a flyer in hand. Auntie, Lincoln High's government class asked if you'd speak. Their teacher reached out. Said your story hit their morning announcements. Eleanor took the flyer, her fingers brushing over the words. Guest speaker series. Real people, real lessons. She smiled faintly. That's more my speed, she said. And so, a few days later, Eleanor stood before a class of restless teenagers, most of whom had only seen her story through clips shared on their phones. She didn't stand behind a podium. She sat on the edge of a desk, her cane resting beside her chair, her necklace worn openly, glinting in the sunlight that streamed through cracked windows. I know some of you have heard about what happened to me at Pricewell Grocery, she began, her voice steady but warm, but that's not why I'm here. A few students exchanged curious glances. I'm here because one day, each of you will be in a position to assume something about someone you don't know. And when that moment comes, you'll have a choice. See the person, or see the story you made up about them. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle across the room. A boy in the back raised his hand. But what if they really are doing something wrong? Eleanor nodded, appreciating the honesty in his voice. Then, ask first. Listen second. Act third. The problem isn't stopping someone when something's wrong. The problem is deciding someone's wrong before they even speak. The room went quiet, save for the hum of the overhead lights. Another student, a girl in the front row, leaned forward. Do you stay calm when people treat you like you're nothing? Eleanor smiled softly, her voice gentle. Because their ignorance doesn't lower my worth. I knew who I was before they spoke, and when they finish talking, I'll still know. The bell rang, but no one moved right away. They sat there, letting her words fill the spaces between them, lingering long after the noise faded. As the students packed up their bags, one girl approached Eleanor shyly. A grandma was stopped by security at a mall last year. They said she looked suspicious. She cried when she saw your story. Eleanor touched the girl's shoulder lightly. Then tell your grandma she's not alone, and neither are you. She left the school quietly, as she always did. No reporters followed, no crowds waited. But behind her, a generation of students had heard something they wouldn't forget. And sometimes, that was the real work. The next week, Eleanor found herself back in that same high school classroom. This time, the seats were packed. Word had spread. Students who weren't even enrolled in the government class squeezed into the back, sitting cross-legged on the floor or standing by the door. Eleanor stood at the front of the room, her cane resting against the whiteboard, her necklace catching the afternoon light. She smiled faintly at the rows of curious, expectant faces. She didn't raise her voice. She never had to. Respect, she began, is what you offer before someone shows you their resume, before they tell you their rank, before they explain their struggle. The room quieted, save for the scratch of pens against notebooks. I spent years in rooms where men wouldn't listen to my voice until they saw my clearance badge. But by the time they listened, the problem was already solved. She paused, letting the words breathe. Berlin, 1989, she continued softly. An encrypted message crossed my desk. In it, I found a pattern. At first it looked like routine chatter, but beneath it was a code warning of a staged riot designed to distract the world's media while weapons were smuggled across an unarmed airstrip. The students leaned forward, eyes wide. I cracked that code in 97 seconds, fast enough to reroute the teams, stop the shipment, and prevent a disaster that never made the news. The world stayed quiet that day, because someone you never heard of did their job. A girl in the second row raised her hand hesitantly. Didn't you tell anyone before now? Eleanor smiled gently. Because doing the right thing doesn't always need an audience. But sometimes silence lets others believe the story was never yours to tell. She looked around the room, meeting their eyes one by one. You don't have to wait until you're my age to start seeing people clearly. You can start today. The janitor in the hall, the cashier at the store, the stranger on the street. You don't need to know their story to treat them like they matter. The bell rang, sharp and sudden. But no one moved until she quietly closed her notebook and said, "That's enough history for today. Now go make your own." And just like that, she gathered her cane and left the room in thoughtful silence. That evening, the city council met in a packed chamber. The mayor stood at the podium, his notes trembling slightly in his hands, but his voice steady. Still, she looked different, haggard again. We've treated respect like it's a reward, like it's something earned after proving your worth. But dignity doesn't work that way, and Ms. Eleanor Price reminded us of that. He paused, looking across the room at faces both skeptical and hopeful. That's why tonight, I'm introducing the Community Respect Act. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. He continued, letting the weight of his words settle. This act will require anti-bias training for every public-safety city official. Police officers, first responders, clerks, security guards, transit workers. Everyone who serves this community will learn to see the person first, not the stereotype. He raised his eyes, locking on the reporters waiting to spin his words. This isn't about optics. It's about obligation. The police chief shifted uncomfortably in his chair but gave a subtle nod of agreement. The mayor pressed on. We will also create a community dignity board made up of residents, veterans, faith leaders, and educators to oversee complaints of profiling and mistreatment. No more investigations buried in bureaucracy. A few people clapped softly. And lastly, public spaces, including every grocery store, library, and community center, will be required to display clear policies against profiling and discrimination. No fine print, no legal jargon, just a reminder in plain language that dignity is not negotiable in this city. The room was silent for a beat. Then, slowly, the applause began to grow. Not thunderous, but steady. The kind of applause that meant people weren't celebrating, they were committing. Outside, the news spread fast. Community centers posted about the new initiative. Local businesses debated what it would mean for their staff. And over at Pricewell Grocery, something small but powerful happened. Regional manager, who had spent the last week avoiding the press, gathered his staff in the break room. "We can't erase what happened," he told them, "but we can make sure it doesn't happen again." He pulled a sheet of paper from his folder and held it up. "This is going up today by the front entrance." It was a simple sign, laminated but unadorned. "Disagreement is not a discount. It's policy." No fancy logos, no corporate jargon, just truth. And beside it, in smaller letters, "If you can't see the person first, you don't belong behind this counter." He looked around the room at faces young and old, tired and unsure. "And starting next week," he continued, "we'll be holding empathy workshops. Not just customer service training, real empathy training, led by some people who've lived what we've missed." The room shifted, some skeptical, some relieved. And when one of the younger cashiers asked who'd be leading the first workshop, the manager smiled faintly. Mrs. Price's former colleagues from the VA. The room fell silent, the weight of it finally sinking in. Change wasn't just coming from the top down. It was coming from the inside out. By Friday afternoon, the first empathy workshop began in the break room of Pricewell Grocery. It wasn't mandatory by law, yet, but it was the first of many quiet changes that didn't need headlines to matter. The room was smaller than expected. Just 10 employees sitting around a circle of plastic chairs, shifting uncomfortably, waiting to see what this would be. And then they entered. 3 men and women from the Department of Veteran Affairs Intelligence Directorate, dressed plainly but carrying an unmistakable presence. They weren't there to talk about covert and covert missions. They were there to talk about being overlooked, misunderstood, dismissed. One woman, Ms. Rivera, spoke first. "You don't have to know someone's whole story to treat them with dignity. You don't have to see their service record to hold the door open." She paused, looking around the room. "Because some of us saved lives from the shadows and still get followed in stores like this." A young cashier, Jamal, raised his hand slowly. "What are we supposed to do when we're told to watch people who look a certain way?" The question hung in the air, raw and honest. Another veteran, Mr. Chang, leaned forward. "You start by questioning the story you were given, not the person standing in front of you." They shared stories of what it felt like to be heroes one day and suspects the next. About how service didn't erase skin color, how sacrifice didn't cancel out assumptions. And by the end of the session, no one was checking their phones. They were listening. Later that evening, Eleanor stopped by the store. She wasn't there to check up on anyone. She just needed oatmeal and tea. But as she walked in, the sign by the entrance caught her eye. "Easy, not a discount," intoned Crispo. She paused, letting the words wash over her. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like a lesson or a headline. She felt like a person running errands. As she approached the register, Jamal smiled at her warmly. "Good afternoon, Ms. Price. Can I help carry your bag today?" She smiled softly. Only if you're offering, not assuming. He laughed, the kind of laugh that didn't feel forced. Offering, ma'am. Always offering. She handed him the bag, her shoulders a little lighter than before. Outside, the town felt the same. Cars passing, people scrolling through their phones, kids racing down the sidewalk. But something had shifted. Quietly. Permanently. The Community Respect Act passed 2 weeks later, but Eleanor didn't attend the ceremony. She didn't need to. Change had already begun where it mattered. In people's choices when no cameras were watching. In the classrooms where students now asked better questions. In the break rooms where assumptions were finally being unlearned. And in the faces of the people who no longer looked through her, but at her. Because in the end, Eleanor Price's legacy wasn't just the medals no one had seen. It was the simple truth she lived every day. That dignity wasn't earned. It was owed. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Eleanor Price once again found herself walking toward Pricewell Grocery. The sidewalks were as familiar as ever, worn by decades of footsteps, the morning breeze cool against her cheeks. But this time, something felt different. Her cane tapped softly against the pavement, steady as her breath. She crossed Maple Street, where cars slowed respectfully at the crosswalk without hesitation. For the first time in a long while, no one honked impatiently. No one stared through her like she was invisible. At the front doors of Pricewell, the automatic sensors greeted her with a soft chime. The familiar scent of coffee and floor wax drifted out. But the sign above the entrance stopped her briefly. Dignity is not a discount, it's policy. She read it once, then stepped inside. Behind the customer service counter, Jamal spotted her and waved, a wide, easy smile spreading across his face. "Morning, Ms. Price. Good to see you again." She smiled faintly, tipping her head in greeting. "Morning, Jamal. Good to be seen." An older woman, arranging the floral display near the entrance, offered a warm nod. "Let us know if you need anything." Even the security guard posted near the front, Officer Hendricks, new to the role but trained in the department's recent reforms, stood straighter when he noticed her. He approached gently, his voice respectful, not rehearsed. "Mr. Price, welcome. If you need assistance with anything today, please let me know." Eleanor paused, studying his face. Not suspicion, not pity, just sincerity. She nodded once. "Thank you, officer. I'll manage just fine." And with that she took her usual route down aisle 5, her cane tapping rhythmically against the polished floor. No one stopped her. No one followed her. No one questioned why she was there. They just saw her, an elderly woman doing her shopping, exactly as it should have been from the start. She paused at the shelf of oatmeal, selecting the brand she always bought. The same simple ritual, but this time without the weight of someone else's assumption shadowing her peace. And for the first time in weeks, the act of reaching for a box of groceries felt like freedom. As Eleanor turned the corner near the dairy section, she overheard them. 2 teenage boys, standing near the freezer case, whispering in hurried excitement. They tried to act casual, but their voices carried just enough to reach her ears. "Dude, that's her. That's the woman from the necklace story." "The one from the video? No way." "Look, that's the necklace. Same one from the news. She's right there." Eleanor paused, her back still to them, a faint smile curling at the corner of her lips. Not pride, something quieter. For years her service had been invisible, tucked behind the walls of classified briefings and forgotten memos. Now, 2 kids in a grocery store aisle recognized her, not for the medals or the headlines, but for the moment she stood her ground, without raising her voice. She turned slightly, enough to catch their wide-eyed expressions. With a small nod and a knowing smile, she spoke softly. "Being seen doesn't mean much if it ends with a video. What matters is what you do next." The boys froze for a second, unsure how to respond, then both nodded respectfully. One stammered out, "Thank you, for everything." She gave them a small wave and continued on, leaving them with their awkward awe, and something more meaningful, a reminder that courage can look quiet, steady, and ordinary. As she approached the checkout lanes, a mother with a toddler in tow gave her a gentle smile, and the cashier rang up her items without rushing, without assumptions. "Will that be all for today, Miss Price?" the young woman asked warmly. Eleanor smiled faintly, placing her hands atop her cane. "Yes, desperate." Jamal appeared again from a nearby lane, holding a brown paper bag. "I've got it, Miss Price. Let me walk you out." She hesitated for a brief second, but this time she accepted. "All right, Jamal, let's walk." Release closed his eyes. As they stepped outside, the morning sun spilled over the parking lot, casting long shadows behind them. "Feels lighter in there now, doesn't it?" Jamal asked, adjusting the bag in his arms. Eleanor gave a small chuckle, soft and dry. Funny how a little truth makes all the difference. They stopped at the curb where her rideshare would soon arrive. Jamal handed her the bag with care. "Thank you," she said sincerely. He smiled wide, shaking his head. "No, mama," diminished in for her, reminding the rest of us what dignity really looks like. She nodded once, and for a moment the noise of the world faded away. The store doors slid open and shut behind them, customers coming and going, the world spinning as it always had. But today, it spun just a little differently. That evening, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the silence around her. Her groceries were neatly put away. The kettle simmered on the stove. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, soft and golden, casting shadows across the table where her necklace lay. She picked it up slowly, letting the chain slip through her fingers like a thread of memory. For years, this necklace had been her private reminder of battles fought in silence, of victories uncelebrated, of a life measured not by who applauded, but by what was prevented. And for the first time in a long while, she wondered if she still needed to wear it every day. She turned the medallion over, reading the faint engraving she had memorized decades ago. Department of Veterans Affairs, Directorate for Intelligence Support. But now, when she closed her eyes, she didn't just see encrypted transmissions and late-night code breaks. She saw the faces of young students leaning forward in a classroom. She saw Jamal's smile at the grocery store. She heard the soft voice of a teenage boy whispering, "That's her." It wasn't the medal that gave her worth. It never was. She took a small wooden case from the shelf beside her chair. Inside were the simple things she had kept from the world. A folded note from her first supervisor at the NSA, a black and white photo of her team in Berlin, and a tiny key to a desk she no longer owned. Gently, she placed the necklace inside the box. She closed the lid softly, not as an ending, but as a choice. Not everything needed to be worn to be real. She leaned back in her chair and let the stillness settle. For a long time she had carried the weight of needing to remind the world who she was, but now the world had caught a glimpse, and more importantly, so had she. She didn't wear the necklace for attention, she wore it to remember. And now she remembered without it. As night fell, she poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the streetlights blink on, one by one. Neighbors walked their dogs, families returned home from work, and the world spun on. But something in her had changed. She no longer felt invisible in her own life. There would still be those who judged her by her cane, her skin, her age, but their judgment was no longer a weight she carried. Her worth wasn't up for debate. A few days later, Simone stopped by after work, setting her briefcase down with a sigh. "Auntie, the news is still running stories about you. They're calling you the quiet sentinel of Pricewell. Did you ever think something like this would happen?" Eleanor chuckled softly, shaking her head. No one notices the guards who keep the wolves away. They just complain about the quiet, until it breaks. Simone smiled, pulling up a chair beside her. Are you happy it's finally out in the open? Eleanor thought for a long moment, sipping her tea. I'm not sure happy is the word, but I'm relieved the next woman walking down aisle 5 won't be alone anymore. Simone reached across the table, squeezing her aunt's hand. And the next girl in my class who reads about civil rights won't think it ended 50 years ago. Eleanor smiled at that. That's the part they never teach in textbooks, that dignity isn't history, it's a daily choice. The room fell into a comfortable quiet. As the evening stretched on, Eleanor felt something she hadn't in weeks. Not exhaustion, not defiance, but peace. She had been seen, not for what she wore, but for who she was. And that was enough. The first letter arrived quietly. No fanfare, no headlines, just a simple white envelope tucked among Eleanor's bills and newsletters. She carried it inside with the rest of her mail, expecting nothing more than a coupon or a church bulletin. But when she opened it, her fingers paused. The handwriting was careful, almost hesitant. Inside was a single page, folded neatly in thirds. The words were steady but personal. You mustn't, Price. I watched the video of what happened to you. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm a specialist in the 22nd Infantry, stationed overseas. Last week, I walked into a convenience store near base in uniform, and the clerk asked me 3 times if I could afford my own purchase. I said nothing. I kept my head down and left. But when I saw your story, when I saw you standing there, you didn't yell, but you made the world listen, and you made me stand taller in my uniform today. Thank you for reminding me that silence doesn't mean weakness. Respectfully, Specialist Marcus Reed. Eleanor read the letter twice, her thumb brushing gently over the creases. She folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside her chair, next to her old photographs and forgotten commendations. But Marcus's letter wasn't alone for long. By the end of the week, 3 more arrived. A retired librarian from Ohio wrote, I was followed through a bookstore last fall. I left without buying anything, afraid of how I was seen. I wish I had spoken up. Thank you for showing me what grace under fire looks like. A nurse in Texas shared, I carry a stethoscope and still get asked if I'm really on staff. Watching you reminded me, I don't need to justify my place in the room. And a young teacher in Atlanta simply wrote, my students watched your story in class. I asked them what they saw. One said, that's what dignity looks like. They are learning because you stood still. Eleanor placed each letter in the drawer, arranging them carefully like a quiet archive of unseen lives. She didn't read them for praise. She read them for connection. Because for every story told, she knew there were dozens more that would never reach her mailbox. People who stayed silent, not because they didn't feel it, but because they thought no one else would understand. But now, across states and cities, across uniforms and checkout lines, strangers who had never met her now saw themselves in her quiet stand. And that, more than any broadcast or ceremony, felt like legacy. While Eleanor read her letters in the quiet of her home, across town, Officer Derek Klein sat in the precinct's administrative office, staring at the transfer request form in front of him. The lines on the page were simple, but the decision weighed heavier than anything he'd carried before. He had spent the last few weeks attending empathy workshops, listening more than speaking, realizing the damage his silence had caused long before his hands ever reached for Eleanor's arm. This wasn't about saving his career. It was about rebuilding his character. He filled out the request slowly, line by line. Transfer request, Community Outreach Division. Reason for transfer, to build trust where I once broke it. When he submitted the form, his commanding officer, Captain Sutherland, glanced at it and sat back with a sigh. Outreach work doesn't come with promotions, Klein. You know that. Klein nodded, steady and sure. I'm not doing this for rank. I'm doing it because I should have done it years ago. Sutherland studied him for a long moment. Sure, this isn't about guilt? Klein shook his head. It started as guilt, but it has to end with responsibility. After a pause, the captain signed off on the transfer. Effective immediately, Sutherland said quietly. Start with the places no one else wants to go. Food pantries, public housing, schools. Klein left his badge in his locker that day, not because he was ashamed of wearing it, but because he needed to learn how to be a person first. The next morning he walked into Pricewell Grocery, not as an officer, but as a volunteer for the new empathy program. He took a seat in the same break room where he'd once been feared. He listened as Eleanor's former colleagues from the VA led a session on implicit bias. When they opened the floor for questions, one cashier raised her hand, voice hesitant. What do we do when we realize we've been part of the problem? The room fell silent. Klein spoke softly but clearly. You start by saying so, out loud, and then you spend every day after that proving you meet it. A quiet nod passed through the group, some skeptical, some moved, but all listening. After the session, Jamal approached him in the hallway. Never thought I'd see you back here, Officer Klein, but maybe this is exactly where you're supposed to be. Klein gave a tired smile, one that held no pride, only truth. Maybe it is, and for once, I'm okay with learning the hard way. Because in the end, change wasn't about speeches. It was about the hard, quiet work no one clapped for. A few weeks later, on a quiet Sunday evening, Eleanor sat in her living room, a crossword puzzle resting across her lap. The television murmured softly in the background, playing the evening news. She wasn't paying much attention until a familiar name caught her ear. And in our final story tonight, a quiet tale of redemption and reform out of Maplewood, Illinois. What began as a painful moment of public injustice has since transformed one small grocery store and the entire community around it. Eleanor looked up, her pencil pausing mid-word. The screen cut to a clip of Pricewell Grocery's new front entrance. A fresh coat of paint, new lighting fixtures, and in bold, unmistakable letters above the door. Disadvantage is not a discount, it's policy. Dana Myers, the young reporter whose voice had covered Eleanor's story weeks earlier, spoke over footage of a staff empathy workshop. Since the incident, Pricewell Grocery has implemented sweeping changes. Empathy training sessions now run weekly, welcoming speakers from the Department of Veterans Affairs, civil rights leaders, and community members alike. Employees learn not just customer service, but cultural awareness and human decency. The screen shifted to show Officer Derek Klein, no longer in uniform, seated among a circle of employees in the break room. His voice was quiet, but clear. You won't always get it right, but if you're willing to listen, people will help you learn. Next, the camera panned to the new Community Outreach Center inside the store. A small corner with a bulletin board, a bookshelf, and a sign that read, "Your story matters here." Dana continued, her tone warm. What was once a place of hurt has become a space of healing, and the woman at the center of it all, emissary to the president, Eleanor Price, has remained largely out of the spotlight, declining interviews and recognition. The segment closed with a clip of Jamal stocking shelves, smiling as customers passed by. Price didn't seek fame, she sought peace, and in that pursuit, she sparked something far greater, a reminder that respect isn't reserved for the few, it's a right for all. The anchor returned on screen, offering a small smile. And that's what change looks like when the cameras turn off, quiet, steady, real. Eleanor smiled faintly and reached for the remote. She clicked off the television, letting the quiet settle over her home once again. The crossword puzzle still sat in front of her, half finished. She picked up her pencil and filled in the next word. 7 letters, starts with D, ends with Y. Dignity. She circled it once, then again, letting the letters rest there on the page. Outside, the neighborhood moved on. Children played down the block, their laughter echoing across yards. The streetlights blinked on, one by one. A neighbor's screen door creaked open, then shut with a soft thud. No crowds gathered at her doorstep. No reporters knocked on her door. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Eleanor sipped her tea and leaned back in her chair, letting the evening wrap itself around her shoulders. The work wasn't done. It never was. But for tonight she allowed herself something rare. She looked over at the drawer where the letters from strangers rested, a quiet reminder of what her silence had built. Not a movement, but a moment of connection. And sometimes that was enough to change the world. One quiet act of dignity at a time. 2 months later, Eleanor found herself standing before a room filled with women whose stories mirrored hers in ways spoken and unspoken. The annual Women in National Service gathering wasn't meant for applause or headlines. It was a quiet place where veterans shared memories and struggles often left out of history books. She walked slowly to the podium, her cane tapping softly against the hardwood floor, her necklace tucked beneath her cardigan this time. The room fell silent, not out of obligation, but out of respect. She rested her hands on the podium and smiled, faint but steady. "You've heard enough stories about medals and battles," she began softly. "But today, I want to tell you about a grocery run." A few in the audience chuckled gently, unsure where she was headed. She continued, her voice calm and clear. "I went to buy eggs and oatmeal. Simple things. But that morning the world didn't see a veteran. It didn't see a woman who spent 30 years decoding threats you'll never read about in the news. It saw a black woman with a cane, and that was enough to question my presence." The smiles faded, replaced by knowing nods and softened eyes. "I used to think my worth was tied to what I protected, that my silence was my strength. But the world doesn't notice your service. It notices your absence, and it fills that absence with its own assumptions." A hush spread across the room. "So I stood still," she said, her voice firm, "not because I was frozen by fear, but because I refused to shrink for their comfort." She paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. "You don't owe this world an explanation for your presence. Whether you wear a uniform, a necklace, or nothing at all, your worth was written long before their judgment." Tears filled some of the women's eyes, not because they hadn't heard truth before, but because they rarely heard it spoken aloud in rooms like this. Eleanor smiled gently, her voice softening. "Legacy isn't what you leave behind when they call your name. It's what stays standing when they try to erase it." She stepped back from the podium, her message complete. The room didn't erupt in applause. Instead, it filled with something deeper. Quiet recognition, quiet solidarity. And sometimes that was enough. After the event, Eleanor stepped outside into the cool evening air. The night was quiet, save for the soft hum of traffic in the distance, and the gentle rustle of leaves caught in the wind. She adjusted her cardigan, grasped her cane firmly, and began the slow, steady walk home. The streets were still the same streets that had seen her judged, but tonight they felt different. Not because the world had changed completely, but because she no longer walked through them unseen. As she passed the corner store, the clerk inside looked up and gave a small wave. She returned it with a nod, brief but warm. Near the park, a group of teenagers sat on the benches. A few glanced her way and offered polite nods of acknowledgement. No whisper, no stares, just recognition. Even the patrol car parked near the crosswalk didn't tense when they saw her approach. Officer Hendricks stepped out, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Evening, Ms. Price," he greeted with quiet respect. "Evening, Officer Hendricks," she replied. No tension, no fear, just a simple exchange between neighbors. She continued walking, her cane tapping softly against the sidewalk, each step steady, each breath her own. And as she walked, something simple yet profound washed over her. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. No one asked her to explain her presence. That, she realized, was the victory. Not the applause from the veterans gathering, not the media segments or public policies. It was this: the quiet normalcy of being able to walk home with nothing but her own thoughts, her own story, and her own peace. As she neared her street, the porch lights glowed softly in front of each home. Familiar sounds drifted from living rooms, televisions humming, children laughing, radios playing old jazz records. Life moved on, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like part of it, not an exception, not a disruption, but simply present. When she reached her front porch, she paused to take it all in, the wind stirring the leaves, the distant sound of a train whistle, the steady pulse of a neighborhood breathing as one. She smiled softly to herself, her hand resting on the worn railing. It wasn't a grand ending. It was something far better. Peaceful, steady. She unlocked her front door, stepped inside, and let the quiet wrap around her like an old, familiar coat. Because sometimes the greatest victory wasn't being heard. It was being able to leave the noise behind. Later that night, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, her tea steeping quietly beside her. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the table lamp. She reached into the drawer and pulled out the small wooden case where her necklace now rested. She opened it gently, running her fingers over the familiar chain, feeling the quiet weight of it against her palm. For so long she had worn it, not to be seen, but to remind herself of who she was beneath the world's assumptions. Now, it rested beside her, not as proof of her worth, but as a memory of the battles she no longer had to fight alone. She set the necklace down carefully beside her tea and picked up a well-worn crossword puzzle. Her pencil moved across the paper, filling in quiet victories, one letter at a time. In the stillness, her thoughts wandered. She thought of Marcus Reed, the young soldier whose letter still rested in her drawer. She thought of Officer Klein, who now sat in community circles instead of patrol cars. She thought of Jamal at Pricewell, smiling without fear or pity. And she thought of the students at Lincoln High, who now knew that power didn't always look like a uniform or a badge, but sometimes a cardigan and a cane. Her story had stretched farther than she ever intended, touching people she would never meet. But it was never about going viral, it was about going home, and knowing that when she did, she could finally sit in peace. She sipped her tea, savoring the warmth, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards, the familiar quiet of a life lived fully and unapologetically. These were the things that mattered. She smiled faintly, not for the cameras, not for the headlines, but for herself. She didn't need to wear the necklace every day to know her worth. But if one day she chose to wear it again, it would be for her reasons, not theirs. She looked out the window, where the night stretched on calm and unbroken. And for a final quiet moment, she let her thoughts rest on a single truth. You shouldn't need a necklace to be seen. But sometimes, it takes one to remind them to look. And sometimes, it takes one to remind yourself. With that thought, she closed the puzzle book, finished her tea, and let the night hold her steady. Because in the end, legacy wasn't about who remembered your name. It was about who stood taller because you refused to shrink. And for Eleanor Price, that was enough.